Today we're going to talk about aircraft performance and the time that I nearly got caught out trying to take off from a runway even though it was more than 1 mile long. Welcome to the Decision Making Debrief. We know to check the weight and balance and performance figures before we go flying and to apply the relevant safety factors to those calculations. But I'm going to share with you an example from a flight I undertook more than 6 years ago now that gave me a fright. I'm not kidding, it really shook me up. Because despite doing all these calculations, I still ended up using every millimetre of the runway despite it being over 1 mile long. So here's the scenario. I was in a PA-28 about to take off from Biggin Hill to Blackpool, quite a long flight in a Warrior, and I have 2 passengers with me. None of us is particularly skinny. I've chosen to take the maximum fuel that I can, 155 litres, almost enough to get me there and back. I was always really conservative with fuel back then, but this fuelling decision leaves the aeroplane at exactly its maximum takeoff weight. That said, looking at the performance charts, the takeoff should be perfectly achievable, and doing a normal takeoff without flap, I should have nearly 700 metres to spare. So yes, I'm heavy, but I've taken great care to ensure that I'm not over the maximum takeoff weight. I'd either been really strict with the passengers, asking them to weigh themselves and report back to me honestly, or even taken scales to the airport to do it there. It was a long time ago, so I can't remember precisely. Plus, I have ample runway. So what went wrong? As I taxied to the runway, I reviewed my takeoff performance calculations. I had some performance figures here. 0 flap, 937. Well, you could put some flap in, I suppose. Get us off a bit earlier. I bottled out on taking off with no flap and put in 2 stages for a short field takeoff. I know that seems like a pointless, crazy decision. I have ample runway in theory. But my relative inexperience 7 years ago and the fact that I'm taking off at maximum weight caused me to try and shorten my takeoff roll. We'll try and stay on the ground as long as we can. I just don't want to get up and then start stalling.
I'll be honest, I don't think we want you to either.
It's clear that I'm aware that I'm operating at the edge of the aeroplane's safe envelope, but continue on. I was cleared for takeoff with a 5-knot tailwind component. Not ideal, of course, but I've already factored that into my performance figures, so I'm expecting that to be fine. But when I applied full power and then released the brakes, the aircraft was slow to accelerate, and it doesn't come as a surprise to any of us. The takeoff roll was about as long as I expected, and I rotated at just under 65 knots, but then the aeroplane didn't want to climb. It was a real struggle, to be honest, and the only way I could get a climb going was by retracting the flaps and increasing speed, and even then it wasn't great going at first. Eventually things did improve and we were able to continue without further incident. I was pretty shaken up by it though. So let's have a look at what I think happened here, and there are a fair few possible factors. Firstly, the aircraft weight. Had I really been accurate with my weights and calculations? I'm sure I had been, but there is a remote possibility I'd made a mistake. What about that tailwind? Taking off or landing in a tailwind increases the risk of an accident. Perhaps given that I was taking off at maximum weight, I should have requested the interwind runway. That runway also benefits from having a very shallow downslope too. While the tailwind and upslope that I accepted had been factored into my takeoff performance figures, the tailwind strength would have increased as soon as I got airborne and only get worse, increasing the distance it was taking me to climb out. Next, and I think most importantly, let's look at how I operated the aeroplane. Completely unnecessarily, I decided to take off with 25 degrees of flap. That's 2 stages in a Warrior. And that got me off the runway earlier, but it did introduce a fair chunk of drag, degrading the aeroplane's climb rate. And despite choosing to do a short field obstacle clearance takeoff, I didn't operate the aeroplane in accordance with the manual for that type of takeoff. I chose to take off at around 65 knots, staying on the runway as long as I could to build speed, thinking that would help me. But according to the pilot's operating handbook for the Warrior 2, the correct technique in this configuration should have seen me rotate at the much slower speed of 52 knots, climb at 57 until clear of obstacles, and then accelerate to 79 knots, retracting the flaps slowly. Because I rotated at just under 65 knots, didn't really give the aeroplane time to accelerate in ground effect. You saw me on that video go straight into the climb. And I tried to climb out at 65 knots. It was very, very hard going. I then retracted the flaps before accelerating to 79 knots rather than after, and only really began to climb when the aeroplane reached 79 knots, the best rate of climb speed. Another factor worth considering was the age of this aeroplane's engine. While it was properly maintained and serviced, it's unlikely to have been operating at its best, given it wasn't freshly overhauled. So what did I learn from this? Well, firstly, when flying at or near to an aeroplane's maximum takeoff weight, great care needs to be taken. I'm really cautious about that now. Climb performance will be poorer and you need to be sure of your numbers, perhaps weighing your passengers and getting rid of any junk in the baggage compartment. Next, tailwinds. I need to avoid them as far as possible. They substantially increase takeoff and landing distances. Even at slow wind speeds, 5 knots can make a huge difference. And finally, I must operate the aeroplane in accordance with the manual. Anything other than that, I'm essentially a test pilot. Takeoffs and landings are where most incidents occur, and that will be the subject of the next safety workshop from Astral Aviation Consulting. They're talking about taking off and landing safely. The workshop is at 7:30 in the evening BST on Wednesday the 19th of June. To join us, register for free at astralaviationconsulting.com. And if you enjoyed this debrief, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'll be back next month with the next in the series.